Now that you know the basics of importing in Python, it's time to talk about absolute imports. Performing an absolute import just means that the resource to be imported is identified using its full path from the project's root folder. For this example, imagine you have a project called projects, and within this project are two packages, package 1 and package 2. Package 1 contains a pair of modules, and module 2 has a function called function 1. And when you call this function, all it will say is it'll just print out that this is function 1 for module 2, which is in package 1. And that way, if you're able to run this, you'll know that your import was successful. Package 2 is a little bit different. It has an init.py file, which contains a class called class1. It also has a pair of modules that don't have anything in them right now, but it also has a subpackage called subpackage1, which contains module 5, and this has function 2, which, like before, prints out that this is function 2 from module 5 in subpackage 1. So this directory is set up to show some of the different possibilities that can happen as a project gets larger and larger. So if I were to open up the terminal, and let me bring this up, and let's change directories into projects, so that if you list everything out, you'll see package 1 and package 2, and then start the Python interpreter. So if you wanted to import module 1, you could say something like from package 1, import module 1, and that would work. And this is telling Python to go ahead and look inside package 1, and then find module 1 and import this resource. But since we don't have anything here, that's not too helpful. So let's look at module 2 again, and take a look at two different ways to import function 1. So if you were to do the same thing, and say from package 1, import module 2, now if you try to run function 1, you're going to run into an error. And that's because it's not defined. So even though Python knows to look in package 1 for module 2, you're importing this module 2 as an entire resource. So if you wanted to call function 1, you would then have to say module 2 dot function 1 and call it off of that. Now it can get annoying to have to type out the module over and over again. So here's where you could do something like from package 1 dot module 2 import function 1. And now from within module 2, you bring function 1 into that cache. So function 1 should work by itself. While this works, it also brings function 1 out of module 2's namespace and can cause some conflicts. This is where you could import something as something else to avoid these issues. So if you did something like from package 1 import module 2 as, and let's just say something like mo. Now you could do mo dot function 1, and that would work as well. Now we can mess around with package 2. So if you wanted to, you could say from package 2 import class 1. And to make sure this is working, just do something like c equals class 1, and that works just like that. So here, because package 2 has this init file, anything that's in here is then imported by importing the package name above. Finally, let's try to get to this module 5 function 2. And just like before, you can say from package 2, and then look inside that subpackage 1, and then inside module 5. You're going to want to import function 2. And just like that, function 2 works. And that's pretty much all there is to absolute imports. The main thing to remember is that wherever you are, you have to define from the project's root the entire directory structure to get to whatever resource you're trying to import. PEP 8 recommends absolute imports because they're pretty clear and straightforward to use. Another benefit about them is that if the location you're calling that import changes, it'll remain valid. Because of this, you might be thinking, why not always use absolute imports? And while it's true that you should use them as much as possible, depending on your project, they can result in very long lines. So for here, you're looking at a package with a subpackage and a module, and depending on what you're working for, that might be very shallow. You could end up with dozens of subpackages and modules, and at that point, it's not feasible to write that all the way out for every import. This is where relative imports come into play, and you'll learn how to use those in the next video. Thanks for watching. Now that you know how absolute imports work, it's time to talk about relative imports. Something to note about relative imports is that these are based off the name of the current module. What this means is that if you run your script, that script's name is going to become main. In this case, any imports into that script need to be absolute imports. The benefits from a relative import come from going from resource to resource within a package that is then imported. Because of that, we'll only show syntax examples of how to do relative imports across the project's package from the directory from before, and we won't run any actual code. To get started, take a look at module1.py within the package1 folder. Module 2 had function1 in it. Let's say that you wanted to get function1 from module 2 into module 1. With an absolute import, you'd have to do something like from package1 dot module 2 import function1, which is pretty short but still has quite a bit of typing. Because module 1 is already in package 1, you don't need to define that. You can go ahead and get rid of that, and this single period here will represent the current directory that module 1 is in, which is package 1. This becomes an explicit relative import instead of an implicit relative import like this. In an implicit relative import, Python would have to figure out where this module 2 is located, and this has been deprecated in Python 3. So you have to be explicit about it. Once you find module 2 in the current directory, everything is the same after that. Let's jump over to package 2 to take a look at some different examples. So I'm going to go to package 2, module 3. And from here, let's say you want to import the class 1 from the init file. With an absolute import, you'd have to say from package 2, import class 1, like so. But for a relative import, you just need to have that dot there, because class 1 is located within the current package. If you wanted to get to module 5 within that subpackage, you could do something similar and just say from subpackage 1.module5 import function 2, which was located there. So that makes sense. It's pretty similar to what we did in package 1 up here. Now let's say for module 3, you want to go up to module 2, which is in package 1, and import function 1. This is a little bit different, but relative imports are able to do this. What you would do in this case is say from package 1 module 2 import function 1. So before, the single dot represented the current directory that import statement was located in. 2 dots represents the parent directory of that directory. If you're familiar with any Unix operating system and you run an lsa command, you'll see that you have all of your items that are in that directory, but then you also always have a single dot and 2 dots representing the current directory and the parent directory. If you ever need to go further than that, you can add 3 dots, which will bring you to the grandparent directory. So in this case would bring you to imports, which does not have package 1, so that would not be valid. So depending on how your project is laid out, relative imports can really help keep your code concise. They do present issues if your directory structure is going to change, as that will break your relative imports, and they tend to be a little less readable. It can be a little harder to take a quick look and know exactly where some resource is coming from. Because of this, the advantages of relative imports really come into play if you have a very large project and organize your resources so that ones that work together are located close together. Otherwise, try to use absolute imports as much as possible. And that's it. Now you should have a pretty good idea of how and when to use absolute versus relative imports in your projects. These definitely require quite a bit of practice to get comfortable with, so try splitting up your next project both ways and see how they can work out for you. Thanks for watching. So now you know the difference between absolute and relative imports. In this video, we're going to quickly recap on the differences between the two and when you would want to use one method over the other. First, an absolute import specifies a resource from the point of view of the project root directory, while a relative import is based on where the import statement is located. There are many pros to using absolute imports. First, they're based on the project root directory, so moving files around means you don't have to change their import statements. They're also very readable. Taking a look at an absolute import clearly identifies the resource location. And finally, they're preferred per PEP8. The only real con to using an absolute import is they can be very verbose and repetitive based on your project size. So this is something to keep in mind. Overall, in most cases, you want to use absolute imports as much as possible. Relative imports offer up a couple different advantages. Off the bat, they're much more concise than absolute imports. This advantage is based on your directory structure, so if you organize your modules and packages so that similar resources are located near each other, you can gain a lot by using relative imports. Drawbacks to using relative imports include that they're not as readable as absolute imports, and changing your project can break those imports. Now if you move a file, you often have to change your imports to point to the same resource. Finally, like before, this advantage is really dependent on your directory structure. So if you have files that are often reaching all the way across your directory for a resource, you may not get as much of a benefit out of using relative imports. Generally, you'll use relative imports when your project is very large with many submodules and packages, or you're using frameworks that are structured in a way that relative imports usually work. And that's it. You should have a solid understanding of the basics between absolute and relative imports. This topic can be a bit tricky to understand, so the best way to learn is to go ahead and practice. Try using both methods in your next project and see which one works out better for you. Thanks for watching.